Okay, welcome. 10th of August, Weekly Marks. Today, we'll be briefer. To raise a kind of a fundamental point that relates to our preparation for Volume 3 of Capital. Hopefully, there will be a lecture series on it, but perhaps not. And if not, we're still doing it. Surplus value and profit, and asking ourselves what are the differences or the similarities, because in fact there are, and Marx points this out. So the more general description is the rate of profit measures the surplus value generated in relation to the total capital invested, while the rate of surplus value compares the surplus value to the variable capital, indicating the degree of exploitation of labor. Essentially, the rate of profit reflects the capitalist's perspective, whereas the rate of surplus value focuses on the worker's labor. What more interesting idea of a subject with multiple points of view or standpoints. Now, this is from Harry Cleaver's notes on Capital Volume 1. So the rate of profit is the ratio of surplus values, value S, to lowercase s, to total capital C, which includes both constant capital, lowercase c, and variable capital, lowercase v. Now, rate of property, P prime equals C, capital C, S, which equals lowercase c plus v s. Rate of surplus value, the rate of surplus value measures the surplus value produced relative to the variable capital V invested in labor. Note that the choice here, of course, is to presume something that is variable, that is more like labor rather than capital in that sense, in terms of constant versus variable. And the rate of surplus value is lowercase s prime equals vs. Now, you can see this actually done in a very nice little chart that Duck AI has done for us. You can see 3 columns. First column is attribute. Second column is rate of profit, P prime. And the third column is rate of surplus value, S prime. So you can see the difference of in the formula S over C plus V over compared with the rate of surplus value S over V. Now the focus, of course, or the idea of an emphasis is total capital investment as opposed to a labor investment or wages. Now, automatically, you can see that this can raise an interesting question and a problem that relates to the ages and is perhaps over simplifying. But if we remind ourselves, we go back to the sort of Hegel stuff, that these are elements of something moving in a kind of subsumptive direction that moving from a kind of generalizable element to, or a universal element to a particular element to a singularity, if we remind ourselves of what the Hegel business looks like, always reminding ourselves that we have those kinds of directionality, as it were, built into this. So the focus or emphasis is on total capital investment, the totality of capital investment, as opposed to taking out or emphasizing the labor investment or wages, since that is obviously variable in that sense. Now, we can move all these things around and be more metabolic about it, but let's not do that right now. Now, perspective, of course, and that's the point, is, or the standpoint, as it were, is rate of profit, column 1, column 2 as well. Column 2 is capitalist viewpoint, profit earned. And then from the worker's point of view, it is worker perspective is exploitation, or gives a measure of a kind of level of exploitation, noting, of course, that it's simplified, or may in some ways more problematic, but there's plenty of ink spilled over the issue of wages as a measure of things, of a certain whole set of conditions under which labor operates. Now, magnitude, of course, because of the relative sizes of things, including capital, sorry, give me a second. The magnitude is always smaller than the rate of surplus value. Why is that? Well, you can obviously see that just simply because of the variables, right? S over C plus V versus S over V, and then you could move stuff around for a variety of reasons. But the rate of surplus value, of course, can be higher than the rate of profit. So there is a imbalance or an asymmetry. One easily, just the math shows this. It is a kind of relative measure, of course, but it presumes a certain bias, as I think a lot of ink will show, for questions of what capital is, or how capital develops, or how capital can be accumulated. All of those things make the denominator bigger, and or can anyway. And so the math is sort of there. So the rate of surplus value S prime can be higher than the rate of profit P prime. And of course, calculation basis includes, of course, constant and variable capital, obviously, and rate of our little rate of exploitation, or surplus value, only considers variable capital. What are the implications of this? The rate of profit reflects how much profit is made relative to the total investment, while the rate of surplus value indicates how much surplus labor is extracted from workers compared to their necessary labor. And you can see how complicated that can get by the difference between surplus labor, unpaid labor, and labor that is compensated, and then how messy that can become with the question of labor power. Now, understanding both rates helps analyze the dynamics of exploitation and profitability in capitalist economies. So automatically, when you focus on variable capital, you've already made that jump, as it were, to a labor theory of value. Now, not accepting all of the different elements of, of a kind of determinism, the point being, of course, that you're comparing kind of solids and non-solids. The idea that nature and fixed capital of some kind are not human. And it is a privileging, of course, of human labor, or humans. And working out the difference between labor and labor power helps us focus that kind of question even more closely. Noting, of course, now that in the present moment, given a certain amount of combination of constant and variable capital, we can build robots. We can have AI all of those things, which signify a much larger question that Marx does actually attend to, but he doesn't attend to it quite so much in terms of the calculation of surplus value. Now, why are we doing all of this? So why are all of this hand waving? Well, last week we began looking at Fred Mosley's translation, approach to the translation of the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 1867, which in some ways can be thought of as those elements looked at in a specific kind of way, and in some ways a means by which we can think about the difference between Engels' editing and the original manuscripts of Marx. And this is all aided by the fact that we have an archive of a bigger and more consistent and continually digitized MEGA archive, which gives us a better sense of how to approach the problem, or at least to appreciate the differences between the Engels edited version of Volume 3 and the unedited or the pre-edited version written by Marx from the manuscripts. So that's sort of the point, is to see what was original and what got edited. And we spent last week fiddling around with the idea of the introduction that Mosley gives to the folks' translation, and reminds us that we can think of the text slightly differently. And Mosley already identified some of the differences, but let's look at the text itself. Surplus value and profit. We've seen that the production process, considered as a whole, this is Marx, manuscript 1864 to 67, is the unity of the processes of production and circulation. This point was examined more closely when we considered the circulation process as a process of reproduction in Chapter 4 of Book 2. We may presuppose any period of time we like as the unit of measurement for the turnover of capital, but for the reasons discussed earlier when we looked at capital in general, the year would be appropriate as such a unit. In 1 year, a capital produces a certain quantity of surplus value. For convenience of estimation, we take the number 100 as our standard of measurement, a unit of measurement for the magnitude of a capital, as indeed we did earlier, with the result that the rate of surplus value is expressed as a percentage. Now, if one calculates the surplus value produced in a year or in any other specific circulation period in relation to the total capital advanced, which consists of the constant capital advanced plus the variable capital advanced, the surplus value is transformed into profit. The rate of profit is the ratio of the annual surplus value to the total capital, a ratio which is similarly usually, as I've mentioned before, how so much easier it would be if the Fed would do such data, but alas. Now, the annual, for example, let a given capital pounds constant, 100 pounds variable capital, and let the annual surplus value come to 100 pounds. If we consider this 100 pounds as the offspring of the total capital payment of 500 pounds, we are looking at it under the profit category. The annual rate of profit would be expressed by the ratio 100 divided by 500, which equals 1/5, which equals 20%. And we should say that the rate of profit of the capital amounted to 20% per year, a year. Later on in this chapter, we shall have to give further details and determine how the annual rate of profit is related to the daily profit and hence also to the daily rate of surplus value. Now here, of course, we shall only be dealing with the average day. From the point of view of its material, the profit in the shape in which it directly confronts us here is nothing other than the surplus value itself. Its absolute magnitude does not, therefore, differ from the absolute magnitude of the surplus value which capital produces during a given turnover time. It is surplus value itself, but calculated differently, or as it initially appears, viewed subjectively in a different way. The surplus value is by its nature related to the variable part of the capital and is therefore calculated in relation to this, i.e., to the part of the capital which causes the surplus value to originate through exchange with the price of labor from which it arises in reality. Circulation time, differing as it does from production time, only comes into consideration here as a barrier to the creation of surplus value. As profit, in contrast, surplus value is not related to and therefore not measured against a part of the capital advance, but rather the total amount of capital, without regard to the very different roles which the various constituents of capital play in the creation of surplus value and the production of commodity values as such. Profit, in a material sense, and therefore as an absolute magnitude or quantity, is not at all different from surplus value. It is nevertheless a changed form of the latter, and we shall therefore investigate the significance and importance of this simple alteration of form immediately after the present discussion. In contrast to this, in the rate of profit, or its relative magnitude, i.e., its magnitude as compared with the magnitude of the capital advance, that the surplus value receives not only a new conceptual expression, but also a new numerical expression which differs from its original shape. The profit is the same as the surplus value in terms of its magnitude, but the rate of profit is, from the outset, of a different magnitude from the rate of surplus value. The numerical expression of the same magnitude, for example, the 100 pounds of surplus value in the above example, naturally changes according to whether it is expressed in proportion to a smaller or larger number, whether 100 is measured against 100 or 100 against 500. It amounts to 100% in relation to 100 and only 20% in relation to 500. The rate of surplus value and the rate of profit can therefore only be identical in magnitude in a single case, that is, when the constant capital equals 0. Hence, the capitalist advances nothing apart from wages. See, normally, you'd advanced raw materials or machinery or whatever, and presents the worker with neither the raw material nor the means of labor, such as tools, machinery, etc., buildings, etc. In that case, the variable capital forms the total capital. The surplus value then undergoes absolutely no transformation. If we posit the constant capital, lowercase c, equal to 0, then s divided by c plus v equals s divided by 0 plus v, which equals s to v, and since s over c plus v equals s over capital C, in this case, S over V also equals S over capital C, total capital. Hence, the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital is the same as its ratio to the total capital, so the rate of surplus value equals the rate of profit. Ipso facto. This single case in which the difference of magnitude between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit disappears. Only worth mentioning as far as capitalist production is concerned for the sake of theoretical completeness. If it occurs at all in practice, it is at most an exception on a very insignificant scale in entirely isolated spheres of production, or in conditions in which the subordination of labor to capital is still hidden beneath forms belonging to earlier modes of production. So you can argue for a very interesting set of cases from that, but let's go on. Profit and surplus value, hence also the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, are identical to the extent that the whole of the capital advance is identical with the capital laid out directly in wages. In the investigation that follows, it is always assumed that the constant capital is greater than zero. That is greater than zero. In other words, that at least a part of the capital is advanced by the capitalist in raw materials or machinery, or both together. Surplus value is converted into profit only to the extent that this is the case, and this is the only situation we're investigating in this chapter, ipso facto. Then, hence, although in this first form of profit, the mass of profit is quantitatively identical with the mass of surplus value, and profit and surplus value. Therefore, they are only, therefore, distinguished notionally, conceptually. The rate of profit is, from the outset, also quantitatively distinct from the rate of surplus value. Hence, the latter equals S over V, and the former S over C plus V. In other words, S over total capital C. It follows from this that the rate of profit is always expressed as a smaller percentage than the rate of surplus value, and a given magnitude is naturally expressed in a smaller or larger ratio to a third magnitude in inverse proportion to the ratio in which the latter is itself larger or smaller. Since, however, the total capital, C plus V, is always larger than the part laid out in labor, V, the ratio of the surplus value to the total capital, that is S over C plus V. In other words, the rate of profit is always smaller than the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital, S slash V. In other words, the rate of surplus value. That all seems clear or redundant. It is clear that S over C plus V is always zero. As long as the dividend, the denominator remains the same, and the divisor increases, and this is the same thing, the numerator, the dividend remains the same, and the divisor increases, and this is the same thing, the numerator of a fraction remains the same, and the denominator increases, the quotient declines, or the value of the fraction falls. The same numerical quantity, the surplus value, appears in the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value as the numerator or dividend, but the denominator or a divisor is greater in the rate of profit than in the rate of surplus value. Thus, in the above example, where the total capital of 500 pounds equals 400 times C plus 100 times V, and the surplus value equals 100, the rate of surplus value equals 100 over 100, or 100%, whereas the rate of profit, which is 100 over 400 plus 100 equals 100 over 500 equals 1/5, is only equal to 20%. The rate of profit is therefore expressed, in this case, in a five times smaller percentage figure than the rate of surplus value. It is expressed in a ratio which is 5 times smaller. And in general, S bracket C plus V close bracket 0, comma, C or C plus V is greater than V, and therefore P prime, or S over C plus V brackets P prime. That is to say, in English, the difference between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit is equal to the product of the surplus value and the constant value divided by the product of the variable capital and the total capital. So you're just moving things around. And I won't go through the the notes because it's math. But you can read it at your leisure. The point is that we have certain variables defined, or at least identified. Lowercase c equals constant capital. Lowercase v equals variable capital. Capital C, big C, equals c plus lowercase v, i.e. equals total capital. Lowercase s equals surplus value. S prime, lowercase s prime, equals a rate of surplus value. Lowercase p prime is a rate of profit. And D equals the difference between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, i.e. equals S prime minus P prime. S prime minus P prime. Now, that's a general overall way in which you could look at it. And as we move further along, the above was on page 81 in the Mosley text. 85 to 86, the rate of surplus value as measured against the variable capital is called the rate of surplus value, and the rate of surplus value as measured against the total capital is called the rate of profit. These are two different standards for measuring the same quantity, which therefore express completely different ratios or relations of the same thing, since the difference in standards of measurement implies that the ratios or relations are themselves different. It is the transformation of surplus value into profit that is derived from the transformation of S prime into P prime, the rate of surplus value into the rate of profit, not the other way around. In actual fact, the rate of profit is the historical starting point. Surplus value and the rate of surplus value are, relative to this, the invisible essence to be investigated, whereas the rate of profit, and hence the surplus value in its form as profit, is a visible surface phenomenon. Erscheinung, what is actually present, and forces itself onto our attention as something distinct from the rate of surplus value, is the rate of profit, while there is absolutely no difference between surplus value and profit, either in magnitude or in any other way. As far as the individual capitalist is concerned, it is evident enough that the only thing that interests him is the ratio of the surplus value, or the excess value that he receives from selling his commodities, to the total capital advanced for the production of those commodities, whereas not only is he, the capitalist, not interested in the specific ratio of this excess value to the particular constituents of his capital, it is in his interest to bamboozle people about these particular ratios and interconnections. Capital M dash capital C dash capital M prime forms the movement of capital, and in it, the second M prime is bigger than the first. Thus, 100 pounds dash capital C dash 110 pounds. The difference of 10 between M prime and M is the surplus value, and the ratio in which 100 is used for the production of more money, or in which the sum of value of 100 has been valorized, is the ratio of the surplus value of 10 to the total capital advanced of 100. It is, in other words, the rate of profit. Hence, 10 divided by 100 equals 10p, equals lowercase v over capital C equals P prime. The surplus value, therefore, represents the realized excess, the excess realized in money of the value of the product over the value of the capital advanced, or over the price of the ingredients of production. And the ratio of this excess to the value of the capital advanced is the rate of profit. Now, if the total product existing in commodity form is converted into money, and the capitalist withdraws from this amount of money another amount which is equal to the value of the capital advanced for the production of the commodities, hence withdrawing 100 from the 110, the remainder is equal to 10. being the surplus value obtained, and the ratio of 10 over 100 of this surplus value to the total capital advanced equals the rate of profit. Now, in calculating surplus value as rate of profit, it is related not just to the part of the means of production whose value appears again in the product, but, and it goes further on, because its use value separate from the product, its use value in its old form has been extinguished, but simultaneously to the part of the constant capital which has not been consumed, namely the fixed capital, which is preserved in the production process, the value of which continues to exist after the deduction of a average depreciation, only to lose another part of its value in a new production process. We explained previously that the rate of profit always expresses a smaller proportion of the valorization than is contained in the surplus value. In other words, that in this measurement of surplus value, the level of exploitation of labor is represented as being much smaller than it is in reality. This lesser proportion becomes yet smaller through the fact that the surplus value is calculated on the total capital advance, not just on the part of the capital which is consumed in the course of production, like raw materials, and the value of which is therefore transferred to the product. And hence, with all due respect, you can valorize the waste product or the leavings from that as well. The value of the capital advance, both the constant and the variable constant capital and the variable capital, and both the fixed capital and the circulating capital, the consumed and the unconsumed part of the constant capital, represents the total value of the capital advanced as opposed to the excess of value, which is how the surplus value now appears. Now, this is to be distinguished from the cost of production, as we shall see later. Only one part of the fixed capital, which equals the depreciation, enters into production. And the value of or price of this part of the capital is the cost price. The surplus value is therefore the excess of the price of the commodity over and above its cost price, or the excess of the value of the commodity over and above the value of the capital consumed to produce it. Now, whereas in the rate of profit is by no means merely the cost price, but also the unconsumed part of the capital, which is included as the standard of measurement. In actual fact, the whole of the fixed capital is advanced for production. It must be advanced all at once, at least, in a moment. Although only an adequate part of the value of the machinery, for example, is transferred to the product, the whole of the machinery is needed, obviously, to produce the product. The total value of the machinery must therefore be advanced for production, although it's only transferred to the product piece by piece in a series of turnover periods. The objective character, the bestimum of the cost price of the commodities, is that it is the total value of the capital consumed for and in production. Hence, the part of the value of the commodities which replaces the constant capital and variable capital consumed in producing it. From the subjective standpoint of the capitalist, the cost price is the part of the commodity value for which he has paid or must pay in an equivalent which replaces the capital he has advanced. And here, the objective character, the Bestimmung of the cost price of the commodities is that it is the total value of the capital consumed for and in production. Hence, the part of the value of the commodities which replaces the constant capital and variable capital consumed in producing them. From the subjective standpoint of the capitalist, the cost price is the part of the commodity value for which he has paid or must pay an equivalent which replaces the capital he has advanced. And here, where all that is involved is the value of the capital, it is the part of the commodity value which costs him or has cost him money. But the surplus value is the excess quantity above and over this cost price. I know that all may seem pretty clear to you. I've included in today's little talk here an outline of Marx's discussion on the rate of surplus value, chapter 9, volume 1. And this goes through what we just talked about in further, well, not further detail, but simply in a slightly different version. And recall that I've mentioned that the volume 1 is front-loaded, so this is an attempt to make it as clear as possible. Note, of course, there's an outline of Marx's argument, and it can be viewed as such and has numbers. And the point being is that we should consult a variety of sources in order to talk about this matter. We're still, in some sense, we're still comparing what Volume 3 looks like compared to Volume 1. I've included a link to a capital workbook in slides for Volume 1, which is useful for those who love slides, and also the link to Capital Volume 3, the online version of it. I've included a little bit from Andy Higginbottom's lectures on the circulation of surplus value, and you can see, at least in diagrammatic form on this image, the difference between variable and constant, and that there is a kind of circulating capital going on, or a process of circulation moving along here, and with numbers. So you can sort of do the math in that sense. I've also included a link to stuff that it would include, in fact, the study guide for Capital Volume 3, and there's connections to it, including a link to Heinrich's commentary on Engel's edition of the third volume of Capital and Marx's original manuscript, which I think is important. I won't go through every question, and I think it's important for you to consider these questions because they're the kind of ways in which we get at what did Marx mean, and of course may leave more questions than answers, certainly. And this is from the online edition. So therefore, without going into the discussion elements, I've pretty much gotten to the end of this. I hope that you've enjoyed this little wandering through Volume 3, but more specifically, Fred Mosley's 1864 to 1867 translation with folks to give us a slightly different version, a perhaps purer version of the question of what the difference is between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. Now, in the simplified version, we assume it's similar things by describing it in words, but the reality, of course, is that you can see by the math that there is what is being differentiated is the difference between humans and nature, an anthropocentric, in one sense, division, which I think is really important, considering the kind of humanist or whatever move in Marxist analysis in the second half of the 20th century. I think we need to sort of consider why that was important, because in some ways the reflection of the new translation of Marx is trying to account for all labor, that is, cognitive labor, for example. And so this is why ink got spilled, and I think it's important to consider that because the labor element, the knowledge component of it, has an organic relation to this process, and we can see even though obviously Marx could have thought of it that way, he preferred not to, simply because, in some ways it's just easier to make that kind of a textual suggestion or movement towards what is being exploited. It's a lot harder, although we leave that to analysis of ideology, for explaining the exploitation of the remainder, simply because it seems epiphenomenal, but it actually is just merely ephemeral. So anyway, that gets us to the end of our little discussion today. I apologize for the slight lateness, and we'll be back again with more of this next week, and Weekly Marks. Tomorrow will be dis and dat information, whereupon we may be looking at something slightly different. So stay tuned.